How should Christians think about miscarriage? And why oppose laws that punish a woman who has an abortion if it ends the life of an innocent human being? I'm here with my colleague, friend, co-host Scott Rae. We've had people submit 10 good questions, and we have a bonus if we have time. You ready to rock and roll and tackle some of these?
I love being able to do this, and I think our listeners should know, we get way more questions than we can handle on the weekly cultural update.
For sure.
And so this is a backlog of questions, and what we're finding is about once a month, once every 6 weeks, we get a backlog of questions like this, and so it's a great opportunity for us to just go for it and take all the questions that we have. They're all good ones.
They're all good ones.
So I'm looking forward to getting into this.
And there's a range of different topics, which I think is going to make it interesting. Well, let's dive in. This first question says, how do you share the gospel of Jesus Christ, particularly the deity of Christ, to a former Christian who now considers themselves spiritually and morally Judeo-Christian, but who no longer believes that Jesus is God? Now, let me jump in with some thoughts on this one. Before I would launch into, in someone like this, like all the verses or fulfilled prophecy or evidences that Jesus is God, I want to hear this person's story.
Of course.
Why did they leave the Christian faith? Was it experiential? Was it theological? Was there hypocrisy that they saw? Were they argued out of it? And why doesn't this person believe that Jesus is God? So step number one is, if you want to bring somebody back to the fold of believing Jesus is God, identify the problem first as best as you can, and then address it.
So don't provide a theological answer for what might not be a theological question.
Exactly. Theological, biblical, and that involves just listening. I imagine there's a story behind this that could be hurtful, could be painful. I just want to know what's at the root of it. I also kind of want to assess, how open is this person to hearing evidence? Do they want to know? Are they eager to go to the scriptures? Or is their mind made up and they're like the rich young ruler who's like, sorry, Jesus lets them walk away. So I want to know the root of the issue. I want to know their openness. Now, if this person is not convinced that Jesus is God, I think you can make this case from Mark. I think consistently, I think all four Gospels do this. And I have a short YouTube video in which I walk through Mark 1 and Mark 2 and Mark 3 and Mark 4, in which he does and says things that point to his deity. But I do think the Gospel of John is the clearest. I would go right to John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And theos is used, like in terms of theology, for Jesus. That's one of the few places you see in John chapter 5.
I'd say go to verse 14 too in chapter 1.
There's more in 14.
It says the
Word,
the Word is identified as Jesus himself, who became flesh and dwelt among us.
And then in verse 18, referred again as theos, as God. I think the clear passages are John 5, where they're saying he makes himself, refers to his Father, making himself equal to God. Of course, John 8:58, when he says, before Abraham was born, I am. John 10:30 and 31.
That takes a little interpretation.
Which goes back to Exodus 3,
right.
The reference Jesus is referring to.
It's the way God referred to himself to Moses.
Yeah.
And Jesus is using the same language that God used to describe himself.
Exactly. Good. So in some ways, you're going to have to read these passages, unpack them a little bit, but these are the passages that I would go to.
And I cut you off before you got to John 10:30, and that's probably the clearest one of them all.
I think that's right. 30 and 31, where he says, I and the Father are one, and they pick up stones to kill him. And then it says later, because he's making himself equal to God. And then John 20:28, where before Thomas, I think it's a climax of the gospel, where he goes, Jesus says to him, you can feel the wounds in my hand and my side, etc. But just seeing Jesus is clear that he's God. And he says, my Lord and my God. And this is not Thomas saying, oh my God, this is my Lord and my God. So bottom line to me, I've been reading the Gospel of John daily for 3 months and just been overwhelmed and impressed with the clear claims of deity that Jesus makes. So I'd invite this person to go read through John and own it, and ask this person, are you willing to talk this through with me? That's how I would approach it. What would you add?
Sean, my first response to this is I would share the deity of Christ with this person the same way I would do with anybody else.
Okay.
And I would listen to their backstory of, what has sparked your interest in this. Just sort of tell me a little bit about your spiritual journey. And then, I'd also want to assess, are they open to hearing evidence? Are they open to listen? Because, Jesus warns us against giving hard truth to people who are not inclined to receive it. And so I think we need to be discerning about that. But assuming they're open to hearing it, which I suspect this person is, I would go through exactly the same text that you described. I might include the incident from Mark chapter 2. That first part where Jesus heals the paralytic and they bring him in through the roof. And, the people, Jesus forgives his sins first, and the crowd's aghast and said, no one can forgive sins but God alone. And then Jesus basically is to show that I have the authority to forgive sins, and by implication, and therefore I am God, I say, pick up your mat and walk. So
that's a great example.
I mean, the evidence is not hard to find.
Here's where I would go, is the book The Incarnate Christ and His Critics by Ed Komashevsky and Rob Bowman. I interviewed Rob about an hour and a half, and then we did a live Q&A answering the tough objections. I think that is the single best book on the deity of Christ that I think every Christian should read. The Incarnate Christ and His Critics. Read that, own it, and then you pick the best way to talk to your friend based on his objections.
I'd say More Than a Carpenter is also pretty good.
Yeah,
too.
That's good for starters. Fair enough. All right, so let's shift gears majorly here. This one's really in your lane. Now, you and I have done full episodes on this, but the question is just, should Christians vote? And I know Christians should pray for those in authority, but what biblical principles? It's interesting, it says compel us to vote.
Well, I think in general, we want to render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, which means you render to the political arena what it asks of you, and you render to God what He asks of you. And I think that's fair to say the political system asks of us for our vote regularly to make our voice heard. Now, obviously, that wasn't the application in the first century because nobody had the right to vote. I mean,
fair enough.
You didn't vote for Caesar.
Right.
Or vote against. Maybe you didn't vote against Caesar. We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
But I think this is just part of our the general stewardship of our obligations to our communities. And I think we vote for things that are local. I think as a stewardship toward our local and closer communities. But I think we also vote for national things. So I would not take the stance of someone who says, I just vote for the big national issues. I don't care about the local ones. I'm not so sure about that theologically, because I think we have an obligation to love our neighbors. Okay. And I think our vote is an expression of our love for our neighbors and our ability to have our voice heard on things that we think are good for our communities and good for our country. And I know we have a lot of division at the moment. And so what you vote for may be an object of controversy, but I think whether you vote or not shouldn't be.
By the way, render to Caesar that which is Caesar, and to God that which is God. Of course, it's in Matthew 22. And the point is not that God doesn't weigh into politics, because the image of Caesar's on the coin. The image of God is in human beings everywhere in the political realm. So we bring our faith to our politics. But your point is we have a sense of duty to and responsibility to the governing authorities above us. And voting, and again, the word compel is strong. I think those of us who can vote, we can't forget that it's a privilege that we have this. And there's a lot of people around the world, probably some people watching or listening to this, who wish that they could vote
they would like very
as
much
we
to
do
vote
in the States and beyond. So I think it's a privilege. But the guiding principle is loving God and loving others in the way that we vote, in the way we support political candidates, and policies that don't just favor us, but are objectively good for society.
Yeah, it's the same reason we pay our taxes, although you don't go to jail for not voting. But I think it's the same reason.
It's a big difference.
It's a statement that we love our neighbors and care for our communities.
Good word. Of course, there's a passage in Jeremiah that talks about operating towards the good of the society in which we live.
Yeah,
I think has some crossover.
Yeah, which, by the
too.
way, that was addressed to Israel in exile in pagan Babylon.
That's right.
That's right. To seek the flourishing of their communities.
So it's not a command, but I think it's a principle that applies. Good stuff. All right, this one is totally in your lane, Scott. Somebody asked us, could you speak to the ethics of using CRISPR, which is a kind of gene editing technology, to cure Down syndrome? So maybe explain just kind of briefly what that is and if you would apply it to Down syndrome.
Yes. Now, we actually addressed something very similar to this in a weekly cultural update a few weeks ago. I think I've got a date on this question too. It's before this question came in. But CRISPR is basically a pair of genetic scissors that enables in sex cells and early stage embryos to do a sort of a cut and paste job to eliminate the gene that's defective, in this case, the gene that causes Down syndrome, and replace it with a cloned copy of a gene that, when it's inserted, will function properly and prevent. And I'm not sure all the molecular biology behind Down syndrome, what genes are turned on or off, or I'm not sure about that. And what we just recently talked about was a use of CRISPR with basically a molecular GPS to find the exact place in the genome. This is a very young child, so it was a little more complicated than embryos and sex cells. But they found the place in the genetic code that was the glitch that was causing this rare disease this child has, and they pumped in millions and millions of copies of the corrected gene, so in the hope that it would take root in the exact place, and all these genes had the GPS locator on it, so it would get to the absolutely staggering technology. Now, I think the point of the question, I think, is that should we be using a gene editing technology to cure disease if it also has the possibility of being used in some other ways that we would not be in favor of? And I think the answer to that is yes. We are obligated, I think, to use medical technology as God's good gift to alleviate or cure the effects of the general entrance of sin, of which disease, decay, and dying are three of those. Now, we're not going to cure dying, but we can alleviate some of the things that come with the dying process as a result. So I think it is possible that CRISPR technology will be used for things that we don't want, like enhancing otherwise normal traits or selecting traits on your child, producing designer children, selecting for eye color, hair color, height, things like that. None of those are things that we want to do. But I think we have an obligation to use medical technology in ways that are consistent with the goals of medicine, which are theologically informed as correcting, alleviating the effects of the general entrance of sin into the world.
That makes a ton of sense, is that God has given us common grace to use medical technology and given us the call to, the cultural mandate, you might say, the cultural commission.
Or I'd say it could even continues the healing ministry of Jesus.
There you go. And arguably, it seems something like Down syndrome is the result of the fall. Of course, individuals with Down syndrome have no less value and dignity.
Right.
And of course, the efforts in a lot of countries to eliminate them through abortion is not for them, it's for other people that they're deemed a burden upon. A Christian could have nothing to do with that kind of approach.
Well, and the countries actually are applauding themselves on having eliminated Down syndrome.
Countries like Iceland and others.
Yeah, which of course,
yeah.
I can eliminate any disease if you'll allow me to shoot everybody who has it. That's not rocket science.
That's painful. One just quick thing on this before we move on is we do live in an age of kind of critical theory in which we put people in categories based on their sex, based on their sexual orientation, based on their skin color, their socioeconomic status, and whether they have disabilities or not. And these categories become an essential part of who somebody is. And it's wrong to change that, unless, of course, we're referring to biological sex, but that's an exception to the rule.
Or if we're referring to disability.
Or disability is the exception. And that's my point, is that some would say, no, this is a part of who I am and it becomes an identity rather than saying, no, we all have varying degrees of disability. Sure, some far more significant than others. And we had a great episode talking about that a while ago. But to try to use medical care to care for disability is not dehumanizing. It's arguably recognizing the inherent goodness in an individual and reversing the fall. So I think that's where cultural ideas sometimes would come in conflict with a biblical worldview.
Yeah, no, we've got a lot of emphasis on diversity, except for disability. That's the one area that I think has been bracketed out. It's not one of the cool causes that the diversity folks have been all that interested in.
Well, we've had a good conversation on that. That's one I think in due time we need to revisit. This one, to also shift gears again. These are fun, Scott. I actually really like these questions.
Actually, I'm getting a little case of whiplash here.
This one has a little bit more setting up involved to get to the question. It says, in our interview with Preston Sprinkle on his book, Exiles, the point was made that Christians do not find their identity in being citizens of a particular country. Sprinkle said that we should not refer to the military in the country we live in as our troops, since God doesn't have troops. Later, I listened to a weekly cultural update, and I think this was with Jeff Myers, where he discussed that around 50% of Gen Zers are ashamed to call themselves American citizens, as though they would want to call themselves citizens, but are simply ashamed to do so. Person says, these points seem contradictory, and I'm trying to understand how Christians should navigate this tension. Should we claim to be citizens of our country or not? What's your take on this?
Well, I would amend the question slightly,
okay.
and it's a simpler answer. I said the point was made that Christians do not find our identity in being citizens of a particular country. I would say the point that should be made is that Christians do not find our primary identity in being citizens of a particular country. As a penultimate source of our identity, not the ultimate, but close to it. I have no problem with saying I'm an American and being proud of that, while at the same time recognizing that my country is not perfect. And is always, we've always had periods in our history where we have not lived up to our ideals. And I think it's sort of a uniquely American tradition to be self-critical about that, which I think is a point definitely worth applauding. Now, I think, I'm not sure about, our troops, since God doesn't have troops. I'm not sure. I don't have strong feelings about that part, but I think the tension is not difficult to navigate, in my view, as long as we have our loyalties in the proper order. We are first and foremost citizens of the kingdom of heaven. Okay, then we are human beings made in the image of God and redeemed by the blood of Christ. And then we are citizens of our particular country, and then it goes on down from that for our local communities. So I don't think there's a huge contradiction here, but if you're saying that our ultimate identity comes from being a citizen of our country, then we have a problem. But as long as you I qualify that as ultimate identity, I don't think we have issues here that we have to navigate.
So we are ultimately citizens of heaven. We are new creations. We are part of the family of God. That is our primary identity. And so other things, such as the country from which we are from, there's nothing wrong with that. And I would argue, I think there can be something good about loving your country. Now, Christian nationalism, one version of it, errs by saying God uniquely favors my country, or God's promises in the Old Testament uniquely apply to my country. You and I have done episodes on that and given pause to that.
Although
that's different from patriotism, which is a love for one's country, like a love for one's home, without saying God favors one's home. That's the distinction.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I don't hear too many people who live in other countries referring to their country in the same way that Christian nationalists refer to the United States. Maybe some of the theocracies, but I don't hear people in the UK or Sweden or Norway, or other parts of Europe referring to their countries as being theologically the locus of God's activity in the world.
I see a lot of other countries speaking as if they're the center of the earth and the universe, similarly to Christians, but maybe don't use the theological language because they have different historical roots. Here's where I would differ with Sprinkle a little bit. And he's not here to defend himself. We had a 2-hour debate about using preferred pronouns and also gay identity. Should somebody with same-sex attraction identify as being gay? His answer is, at least he started with where you started, as long as your primary identification is in Christ and God, a secondary kind of identification can be in one's same-sex attraction or gayness. So as I understand it, he is fine with that identity, but not identifying in the way it's framed here as terms of a citizen finding our identity in being citizens of a particular country. Now, I don't remember exactly what we said in the interview, so maybe this person has misrepresented his argument and they could come back. But if they've accurately represented it, I would say I'm not in favor of gay identity because although it might be more than same-sex attraction, it's no less. So if same-sex attraction in itself does not line up with God's desire for how we're supposed to live, we should have nothing to do with that as any part of our identity whatsoever, even if Christ is primary. Being an American or being Chinese or being Mexican in itself is not tied to something at odds with how God wants us to live, even if different governments or all governments at some time have done certain things that we think are wrong. In principle, the American experiment is not at odds and is sinful within itself. That's the distinction that I would make. So again, I'm relying upon this. I don't remember the particulars of what he argued in that interview or Exiles. If Preston disagrees, he can certainly clarify. But if she's represented accurately, that's a distinction that I would make.
Good point.
All right, let's keep going. This one, really interested in your take on this, Scott, because this is one I know you've dealt with a lot consulting in hospitals and churches. And the question is related to miscarriage. And this person says, I find miscarriage is missing in abortion pro-life discussions. And this individual said, my wife and I experienced a miscarriage. And by the way, my wife and I did too. They grieved over it and received support and care from their church community. But should the knowledge that a fetus was miscarried because of development issues give us pause when we think about the status of its soul and existence in heaven? How do we biblically think about the unborn who were miscarried?
Well, my heart goes out to this couple who's experienced a miscarriage. My wife and I, our first pregnancy was a miscarriage, and then it took us probably 4 years to conceive again. Which introduced a huge period of pain and suffering, and it was. I say those have been the worst 4 years of my adult life.
Wow,
going through that time. I think my wife would probably say the same. Now, I think one of the things we need to think about here is, yes, embryos and fetuses miscarry for a whole host of reasons. Okay. Some because they have genetic abnormalities that are inconsistent with life. Some because there's some biological, physical problem with the mother that she just can't carry a child to term. Sometimes in an ectopic pregnancy, the embryo implants in the fallopian tube and not in the uterus, a condition which is fatal for both if it's not immediately corrected. So the reasons, and sometimes, and in a lot of cases, nobody knows what the reason for the miscarriage is. We're just speculating. Now, the point that comes out of the question, I'm not sure you read actually this part, but he said, I read that early miscarriage are the result of the fetus not developing properly, and the sanctity of life argument seems to be based on the potential of a fetus's full development and ability to survive outside the womb. The sanctity of life argument is based on neither of those things. Those are outworkings of a prior ontological condition that gives the unborn child the sanctity of life from conception forward. At that point, it's true that although I put it a little differently, it's true that the unborn child has all the capacities that he or she needs to mature into a full-grown adult. I would not use the term development because this is not metamorphosis. We're not talking about the embryos becoming something different at the fetal stage or becoming something different at the newborn or toddler stage. No, there's a continuity of personal identity through time and change because we are not just the physical stuff of which we are made. We have an immaterial component as well. And the ability to survive outside the womb is more a commentary on medical technology than it is on anything ontological with the unborn child. So I would have a big issue with the way that this person, who I sympathize with for miscarriage, but I think the way they are conceiving the argument for the sanctity of life, I think is not quite right.
That was really helpful. So maybe this illustration would help. And maybe it's a morbid illustration. If we had like a 3-year-old that was alone on a small island, parents left, parents died, whatever, that 3-year-old has the capacity to become an adult in the way a fish or sand or a tree doesn't. It has the potential. But if no one comes and rescues it, it doesn't have the practical potential to do so.
But we say those capacities will actualize themselves under the right condition, under conditions that are conducive for that.
So it's the kind of thing that it is being a 3-year-old that naturally has the capacity to develop under the right conditions. The unborn, there might be problems in the womb of a particular woman that's not allowing it to develop, but it still is the kind of thing that can develop if those corrections are made, akin to the 3-year-old. So we'd say there's nothing substantial in the kind of thing the unborn is and a 3-year-old is, just a different environment. So if that's the case, then and we'd have to argue this, I think the Bible does, but from the moment of conception, you have a distinct living human being that for some reason, maybe it's sin, maybe it's just something that happened, maybe it's natural, I have no idea.
Or sometimes we don't even know.
And like you said, sometimes we don't know, dies. Inherently, there's no difference than a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old. How, and we could talk about the age of accountability, which we don't have to go into in detail, but I would tend to believe that God's grace would cover this child because it's not accountable. But in some ways, we can just rest in the goodness of God and who he is, that he will do what's in the best interest of this child, and that's what it is, who died through a miscarriage.
One other point on this, too.
Yeah.
The last part of the question, I think it reveals something about the worldview of this person.
The assumptions.
What should we think about children who did not have the potential of full development and were miscarried? Now, every embryo and fetus has the potential for full development. Okay? Now, they may have genetic abnormalities that don't allow those capacities to be actualized. There may be something in the way the mother's carrying the child that won't allow those to be actualized. But they have all the capacities that they need to mature into a full-grown adult from conception forward, as long as the conditions for their flourishing are met, which are pretty simple and straightforward, actually.
So really, this distinction is irrelevant to the status of the unborn and the fate of the unborn because of the kind of thing that it is.
That's right.
And the capacities it has. Okay. Great distinctions. That was really helpful. All right, this one, we're going to shift again, Scott, and you've written some books on business
ethics. How come these are all in my lane here, man?
I don't know if they're all in your lane. You maybe got the weight of some of these. I'd have to do some math here.
You get the rest of them here.
You probably did get more than half. That's fair. But I'll weigh in and give you my 2 cents. This person says, how might viewing work as mission, being, to use a dated term, thinking biblically about work as a mission field, some would say missional, ultimately dovetail with David Bonson's, what he expressed when we talked about his book Full Time. So we interviewed him a number of weeks ago, and he expressed a certain approach to this. Bottom line, how should we think about work as mission?
Well, here in a word, I would say the business or the workplace as mission is accurate but incomplete. It's one component of how to view your work within a biblical framework. It is. And the reason for that is because most people, when they go to work, they're going to work in places, unless they're at a place like Biola, they're going to work in a place where being a Christian puts them in the minority in their company, for the most part. And it may be that the people that these people work with, you may be the only time that they ever have meaningful contact with anybody who's a follower of Jesus. And in fact, I think most of the folks that we work with are probably not going to darken the doors of our church unless they're already believers. And so I wouldn't want to minimize the place of the workplace being what I would call a strategic soapbox for the gospel, and I think also in the way that you live out your faith consistently in the workplace. And so living it out, I mean, you need words to explain the reasons why you do things the way you do, but that combination of living out your faith and verbally sharing the gospel with people is part of what is involved in the business as mission. Now, the idea of the workplace as mission also is used as a strategy used overseas to get people into closed countries for the gospel when missionaries will, don't bother. But if you can come into a place, say in the Middle East or other places and start a business and contribute to your community, you may also have other great opportunities to present the gospel. So good. I would say the other thing that we need to recognize here is that often the business as mission folks will minimize the actual work that's done and how that contributes to the community that you're in. And the Bible doesn't allow us to do that. Because in Colossians 3, Paul is speaking to household servants, where he says, in whatever you do your work heartily as unto the Lord, for, parenthesis, in whatever you do, here's the punchline, it's the Lord Christ whom you are serving. Which means, if that's true, what that means is that the work that you do is part, not all of it, but part of your service to Christ, is kingdom work, and has eternal significance. And I think that to view our work in that way is, I think, a much more full-orbed way of seeing it. Though what this listener points out, I think, is right. It's just not the whole story.
That's a great answer, that we are to view our work as a mission field, but it's more than that. It's glorifying God, doing our work unto the Lord. It's caring for our neighbors. It's just contributing to something using the gifts that we have. So all Christians should see themselves as missionaries in a sense wherever they are, but our work is more than just a tool to reach people with the gospel. We're contributing to the cultural commission and doing good and loving our neighbors amidst that.
Yeah, and I think if you don't do your work well, chances are you're not going to have an audience for the gospel.
Fair enough. Which, we don't want to turn work into just a utility that has the ends of accomplishing the gospel. The work has a good within itself. Yeah,
it has intrinsic value because God ordained work before the entrance of sin into the world. And remember, in Genesis 3, God cursed the ground, which is different than saying that God cursed work. Work maintained its nobility, even though the setting in which it took place had been tainted by sin.
Good stuff. That's a great answer. That was really helpful. All right, so I'll give my 2 cents to this one first, although it might be to both of us. This person says, I have 2 questions, and just for the record, they listed 3, but, I digress. I have a few questions about art and entertainment. Given the potential tension of Philippians 4:8 to think about what is true and noble and lovely and pure, etc., and the reality of living in a fallen world, which is a great point. The questions are, where's the line between understanding and empathy with darkness and pain in the world and appreciation of art that turns our attention towards God? The second one is, should Christians be entertained by manifestation of sin? Should Christians spend time watching horror movies? If watching such films or other manifestations of sin is acceptable or possibly useful, how do we set such boundaries and limits? Now, actually, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions, but I get the point. Here's my basic take. In both of these, A and B, the person's looking for a line and looking for boundaries and limits. I don't think there's always a line, and I don't think there's always a boundary and a limit. Why? If the Bible said, first off, the Bible would never say you could see up to, say, PG-13 movies, because that was not such a rating then. But even then, even all PG-13 movies aren't equal. Right? I've seen PG-13 movies. I'm like, oh, that's PG. I've seen others. I'm like, that really could be R. I don't know how it got this rating. So the Bible doesn't give us a line. Why? Well, because people have different levels of maturity. People have different levels of experience. People might have different trauma and pain in their life that are triggered by different things. So should we watch horror movies? I'm not going to make a blanket statement. In some ways, it depends upon the horror movies. Not all are the same. But my friend Brian Godawa has said there's actually in horror movies, there's often a recognition that there's good and bad and there's right and wrong. And it pushes back against this relativistic notion within our culture and sometimes reminds us that evil is real and exists. Now, that doesn't mean everyone should watch a horror movie, but I'm more reluctant to make a blanket statement that it's always wrong to do so. I want to push back on the idea of boundaries and limits. And I think the Bible gives us principles. So if a movie is really encouraging you to think about things that are not good, that are not true, that are not lovely, that should give you pause to stop. Now, thinking about things that are evil and broken is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I read Judges. I don't walk away thinking about things, to quote this, like, oh, it's lovely and noble and pure. I'm kind of broken and I'm disgusted. Now, we should be broken and disgusted by the kinds of things in the book of Judges, because the root of that book is that when everyone does that which is right in their own eyes, it leads to this egregious sin and brokenness. So we're going to have to live in that tension. That's what it means. We can err one way or the other. It could be our experience that does it. It could be our community that does it. But I think we're going to have to live in that tension. And the last thing I'll say at this first point is always remembering that we are the easiest one to deceive. We can fool ourselves, and I speak more for myself than anybody else. Oh, I can watch this, not a big deal, because we want to justify things. That's where we've got to be really honest with our motivations, how these movies are affecting us, and then before the Lord, just have wisdom. Agree, disagree? What would you add?
No, basically agree. And one thing I would like to clarify, I wish we had this listener in the studio with us, I could ask, but the person talks about, the appreciation and production of art that turns our attention toward God. I'd like to know what the person means by that, because the horror movies you described, I think, have the ability to turn our attention to God.
That's right.
Because it reveals a standard of right and wrong. There's clear distinctions between good and evil, which implies that there's clearly a lawgiver who decides what is good and what's evil. So I think that the things that turn our attention to God don't always have to be explicit. And I think sometimes what makes good art so good is that you have to dig a little bit to catch the artist's intent. And there are movies that I think can portray really good moral points without being preachy or without being cheesy. And I think some of the best films out there are the ones that exemplify really good virtues, but they often do so in contrast to really terrible vices. And so I'm not sure how you can have a full appreciation for one without also recognizing the reality of the other. And I've had my oldest son is in the film industry, and we've had a lot of conversation about.
I know you have.
About what to include in films, what's gratuitous, versus what's a portrayal just of reality. And filmmakers don't hide from the darkness and the reality of living in a fallen world, nor should they. Now, they don't. I would hope they don't glorify it, or they don't. It's not gratuitous. And I think we can all think of films where both of those things occur. But I think just because something is dark and something is painful, and it's expressed in film because it's the reality of somebody's experience, even if it's heightened a bit, which films normally do, I don't think that puts it out of bounds at all, because that just forms the black background in which, the diamond of the virtues, or whatever the point of the story is, can come out. Now, if there's, I'd like to think that, a lot of our films have good redeeming value to them. There are some that don't.
Sure.
And so but you have to use discernment about how much of the reality of life in a fallen world that you can handle being exposed to. I've got a friend who's in the early stages of dementia, and this person can't watch anything that has profanity in it, because as part of the dementia, that's what they remember, and it stores in their memory, and it comes and it comes out. It will come out more readily as their memory goes. So that's a no-brainer.
Sure.
But I think we probably should be careful just to take stock of how some of this stuff affects our souls. There's certain things I don't really care to watch because I know it's not good for my soul. Other things I think are fine. But I think you're right. I don't see strict boundaries or limits. But the Bible calls us to use good discernment.
And good wisdom. There's multiple books in the Bible about good wisdom. By the way, you and I interviewed Tom Helene, who's our wonderful head of our film and theater program here. Folks can go back to. It's on the podcast, also on my YouTube channel, where we untie some of this. All right, got 3 more for you if we can squeeze these in. This is a theological question now, and also somewhat apologetic. It says, regarding God's sovereignty, does God control everything that happens in our lives, no matter whether it's good or bad? If I get sick and die, can I say that God killed me, or does God only do good things to us? Now, this is a huge question, Scott, but maybe kind of just some principles or guidelines of how you'd approach a question like this.
I would amend the question again when we can make the answer clear. I say, regarding God's sovereignty, does God ordain everything that happens in our lives, no matter whether it's good or bad? That's an easy question, because the answer to that is no, because God does not ordain evil. God's not the author of evil. And if I get sick and die, can I say God killed me? No. You can say that God allowed you to die from that disease for reasons that we'll know more fully when we get to glory. And God does not cause evil. That's, I think, the big takeaway from this. So I don't believe God causes, say, genetic abnormalities for his glory. I think God didn't cause Chris Ralston to be exposed to measles in his mother's womb and give him all sorts of disabilities that he has. So
that'd be your response. So I think with this qualification, I think you'd agree with me. You'd say, if somebody dies, can they say God killed me? Well, there are times where God has killed and has judged through sicknesses, probably with Herod in the book of Acts, through plagues in the Old Testament. So there are times which seem to be the exception of God's judgment, not the norm. And it seems to be in most of those conversations, God makes it clear what he's doing. So we should be hesitant to say, yep, God killed you. But it also says, or does God only do good things? Well, ironically, those are good things. Now, there's a difference between somebody dying of a sickness because of sin and saying that's good. But God judging and sometimes taking life is good. Why? Because God is good. So it's important we don't confuse what we think is good according to a human metric and standard, according to what is good. So even if we don't understand, if we really believe God is good, like the scriptures say, he's righteous and he's justice and he's merciful and he's good in his character, he's holy, then his commands and actions will flow from that, even if we don't understand it. So I wouldn't say if someone gets sick and die, God killed me. Now, God chose not to heal and chose to let us die. We may know why or have a good guess. We might not know until we get to heaven. It might just be the natural result of sin. But barring some very clear prophecy that God is doing this, like we see the exception of the Bible, I would resist that. And I also think when you talk about God ordaining in terms of controlling, yes, God is sovereign. All Christians agree on that. We believe God controls. But the question is, how does God control? There's no debate among Christians that God is sovereign as he does control, and he's moving history where he needs to. There's just going to be differences between, say, a Calvinist view, which leans into God's sovereignty, and not all Calvinists, but more God. Some moves in a deterministic kind of direction. Some would have more of God as maybe controlling and shaping our desires, and we just act according to those desires. And then others would say, yeah, God controls, but we have genuine libertarian freedom, and God knows the free choices we're going to make and creates a world in which we carry them out by our own volition, but God is aware of it. So every Christian perspective, from Arminianism to Calvinism to Molinism, is going to say God is in control and he's directing things, but they're going to differ over the means by which God does it. And answering that would take us way beyond this podcast.
Yeah, I think to summarize, I would say that we would distinguish between God's decreed will and his permissive will.
Okay.
Those things that he directly causes and those things that he allows in his sovereignty.
Fair enough. And even how he reconciles those two, your answer to that's going to depend on your theological system. And at Talbot, we have people who are more Arminians, some who embrace Molinism, and some who have a Calvinist perspective. And that's one thing I love about our school is you can come get, weigh and debate and discuss this and figure out what you think Scripture says. All right, two more. This one, shifting gears yet again. This person says, in 7 Days That Divide the World, John Lennox tries to reconcile the following ideas. So the universe seems old. God specially created the universe and life and human beings. And his model, I'm not going to go into details, is an old earth model. And the question is, can you speak to whether you think these kinds of arguments are valid ways of reconciling the biblical and scientific data? I'm going to make a 30,000-foot response here, so to speak. There has been difference, and there are differences within the church about how to reconcile what we understand as science, even before the formal scientific revolution, and the Scriptures. There's not been one unanimous model throughout the history of the church, like there has been for marriage, by the way. That is a Catholic lowercase c view. There's been unanimity within the church, not in practice, but in belief, until 50 years ago. That is not the case with the age of the earth. So actually, in the updated Evidence Demands Verdict, we put a chapter in there, and I think there's 8 or 10 where we said these are broadly within orthodox position that Christians can differ over. And some of those points are that the Bible is true, that God is the creator, I would say a historical Adam, a historical fall, and then how we work out some of those details, Christians are going to differ. Now, a lot is obviously at stake in terms of how we understand science, old earth versus young earth, the way we would interpret modern physics and cosmology, for example, or evolutionary biology. There's a lot at stake for how we think about science, but there's also a lot at stake for how we understand the Bible. And theologically, how do we understand the genre of generous? Is this poetry? Is this history? Are these long days? Is it not even trying to map up science with history? So I would just say, I think we even have some people here at Talbot, again, some that are old earthers, some who are young earthers, but all believe in kind of those guideposts that I laid out. And I would say John Lennox's book, 7 Days That Divide the World, is one old earth perspective. And he points back to some church fathers to make his case in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries that is a piece of a tradition within the church. Not going to wade in the details of it, but I think it's a live option that Christians should look to as well as other positions when addressing this topic.
That's really a good take on that. I appreciate the framework that you put this in. And I think as long as people recognize that the the uniqueness of where the Earth is placed in the solar system is a marker of a brilliant creator God.
Amen.
And that there are lots of things in the human body that are signposts to a brilliant creator God. I think that's more what matters to me, that we see. I think that you're right about a historical Adam and Eve, because Paul's statements in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15 about death and resurrection of Jesus have a lot to do with the fall, Adam and Eve and the fall being historical people and events. So I'm not quite sure how you put those things together if you don't hold to historical Adam and Eve and a historical fall into sin. So whether, I don't have a big set of preferences about whether the Earth is old or young. But what I am most interested in is that we acknowledge that what apologists refer to as the teleological argument from God, that the earth speaks forth the glory of God. The earth speaks forth His handiwork as a creator. That's I think what matters to me, and I think that's what matters to this listener too. That at the end of the day, that we recognize that God is an intelligent designer, and that the complexity, even at the cellular level, the complexity of the body is probably not something that could have arisen by chance alone.
I agree with that. I think the key is that God is the creator, has revealed Himself through His word, sent His Son to die for death to reverse the sin of Adam. This is the broader story that matters, exactly when God created and how He created. Not unimportant to how we understand science and the text, but not central to the faith itself. I actually view it as a strength that there's different views, and we had these debates within the church. I mean, one of the arguments young earthers will make is, can you have death before the fall? And that's a really interesting question.
Good question.
There seems to be death built into the world, and it seems to the result of fall. Hey, to reconcile that with an older earth? Fair question. Old earthers like John Lennox will bring in some of the challenges of science that seem to push back firmly against a young earth. And then there's science from the other side, of course, and theology from the other side. We don't have to settle that here, but I think it's a strength, not a weakness, that there's a range of options faithful Christians can hold. Last question for you. You ready for this one? And this one is in your lane, so you probably got 6 or 7 of these in fairness.
Fair enough.
So this person's talking about the conversation we've had about abortion, and we both clearly consider abortion a moral wrong, but we oppose laws that would impose criminal penalties on women. Help us understand the reasoning behind this position. Why does it seem like you both would prefer an exception kind of to the rule for women who do something that's morally wrong and not have a penalty when you seemingly would for other moral wrongs like this?
Well, let me think about it by principle first.
Okay.
Because I think, to be fair, it is largely driven by, not largely, but somewhat driven by pragmatism on this. And the pragmatic thing is that if there are criminal sanctions on the women who have abortions, then the likelihood of laws being passed in those states that would protect the unborn, I think, diminishes significantly. And if our goal is to protect more unborn children than less, and this can be a means by which we do that, it's not fundamentally immoral, then I'm in favor of that. But here's another way to think about this, is that the woman is actually not the one who is committing the crime. It's the physician who is the direct agent of the death of the unborn child. And I think this is the reason why in some states that have laws where abortion is illegal, it's the physician's action that's criminalized, not the mother's. Now, I think you can make a pretty decent moral argument that the mother is at best highly complicit in that decision, but I think she is one step removed from the cause of it. And I think I'm open to conversation about the degree to which that makes a moral difference. But I think that's in part the reason why the laws are structured the way they are. And I have huge sympathy for pregnant women who are desperate to, maybe having a child, they have no way to think about even how they're going to care for this child. They may be addicted, they may be poor, they may be out of work, or they may be very young. The pregnancy might be the result of a relationship that they regret. And there are a whole host of things. And so I'm uncomfortable piling on to the woman who may be in very desperate circumstances, where I think the physician, this is recognized, the physician is the actual direct cause.
That's a really interesting answer. It's a combination of pragmatism to save lives, but also the nature of who is doing the wrong. And of course, the question comes in, how much might a woman still be complicit? I think it's some of the interviews you and I have done, and ones I've done separately, of women who've had abortions and repented from this and experienced healing. A number of women who have survived abortions and talk about the conditions that their mother was put in, and really just in some ways powerless and victims in many cases, gives me a lot of sympathy for a woman who has an abortion. That's great. There's in some ways we could probably do a full show on that as I think about it, because it's a question that comes up and I don't hear a lot of clarity on that point. I think you've given us, 2 or 3 good principles to think about, but maybe that's something
we've just scratched the surface on that one.
Yeah, maybe we'll come back full circle on this one.
Good.
All right, folks, there you have it. 10 questions all over the map, from miscarriage to all sorts of topics related to abortion and the age of the earth and the sovereignty of God, etc.
And everything in between.
And everything in between. If you have questions for Scott or for myself, send them our way. You can email us at thinkbiblically@biola.edu. We're going to come back maybe once a month and take your questions like this. So make sure you hit subscribe to this podcast, Think Biblically. Follow the YouTube channel. We've got a lot more coming for you from Talbot School of Theology at Biola University, and we'd love for you to think about coming and studying with us. Thanks for watching. We hope you'll consider sharing this with a friend.